I was the shadow of my golden sister, but when I said I would marry a rich man, they tried to set me up and regretted it. I grew up in a quiet suburb of Dallas, Texas, the youngest in a family of four. We weren't exactly wealthy, but we weren't struggling either. My dad worked in real estate, and my mom was a school teacher. There was this steady hum of routine in our lives, the kind where nothing ever seemed to change. On the surface, it all looked pretty perfect. But as I got older, I started to realize just how much that perfection was an illusion. My older sister Jessica was the star of the family. She was the girl who had it all: beauty, brains, popularity. From the moment she could walk, it seemed like everyone adored her. I, on the other hand, was always the other daughter. Not that my parents ever said it outright, but their constant comparisons made it clear where I stood. Jessica excelled in school, was captain of the volleyball team, and had this effortless charm that made everyone gravitate toward her. I was the artsy, awkward kid who spent most of my time sketching in my room or doodling during class. I loved creating things, but it didn't seem to matter as much as Jessica's straight report cards or her never-ending list of achievements. Family gatherings were the worst. Every Thanksgiving or Christmas, my parents would host these big events with extended family. That's when the comparisons would go into overdrive. My mom would gush about Jessica's latest accomplishment, how she'd won yet another award or been accepted into some prestigious program. Then she'd look at me, a slight frown forming on her face, and say something like, "And Sophie here, well, she's very creative." It was always delivered in a way that sounded more like a consolation prize than a compliment. My dad wasn't much better. He'd joke about how I was one of a kind, or marching to the beat of my own drum, which only made me feel more alienated. There was this unspoken belief that Jessica was the ideal, and I was the project they could never quite figure out. As a kid, I didn't understand why I felt so out of place in my own family. But as I grew older, the constant criticism, even if subtle, started to chip away at me. Every time my mom commented on my weight or my dad made some backhanded compliment about my appearance, I withdrew a little more. I started to avoid social events, not just family gatherings, but school dances, parties, even hanging out with friends. I didn't want to give people more reasons to compare me to my sister. By the time I was in high school, I had developed this overwhelming sense of inferiority. I knew I was talented when it came to art, but it was like that part of me didn't count in my parents' world. They'd always say things like, "Art is great as a hobby, but you need a real career, Sophie." Jessica, meanwhile, was being groomed for greatness. She was going to be a lawyer, a doctor, something prestigious. My parents never said I was a disappointment, but I could feel it in every conversation, in every sideways glance. One day, my school counselor noticed that I was struggling. She pulled me aside after class and asked me how I was doing. It was the first time someone outside my family had actually paid attention to how I felt. I broke down in her office, telling her everything: the comparisons, the criticism, the feeling that I was never enough. She listened, really listened, and then suggested I see a therapist. I was hesitant at first. Therapy wasn't something we talked about in my family, but I agreed, and it ended up being one of the best decisions I ever made. Therapy was a lifeline for me. It didn't fix everything overnight, but it gave me tools to understand myself better and to start rebuilding my shattered self-esteem. My therapist helped me see that I didn't need to live up to Jessica's image or my parents' expectations. I could be my own person. Slowly, I started to find my voice. But the progress I made in therapy was constantly undermined by the continued criticism at home. No matter how much I grew, no matter how much stronger I felt, my parents would always find a way to knock me down a peg. By the time I turned 18, I knew I needed to leave. Staying in that house, in that environment, would only drag me down. I applied to colleges out of state and, much to my surprise, got into a prestigious university in Boston for software engineering. I wasn't even sure why I picked that major at the time. It seemed practical, like something my parents might approve of, but it turned out I was pretty good at it. When I told my family I was moving away for college, their reactions were lukewarm at best. My mom said something like, "Well, it's good to be independent, but don't forget where you came from." My dad barely looked up from his phone. Jessica, to her credit, gave me a book as a parting gift. It was a classic novel, something I probably would have picked up myself if I'd had more time to read. She wrote a short message inside, for when you need a reminder that you can always write your own story. It was the most thoughtful thing she'd ever done for me. College was a whirlwind. I threw myself into my studies, partly because I genuinely enjoyed coding and problem solving, but also because it gave me something to prove, to myself and to my family. I wasn't just the awkward artist anymore. I was excelling in a field my parents could finally be proud of. But even when I graduated with honors, my parents didn't show up to the ceremony. They were on some vacation in Europe, pre-booked months ago, as my mom put it when I called to remind her of the date. It was a punch to the gut. Jessica had graduated a few years before me, and I remembered my parents throwing her this big party. They'd rented out a venue, invited everyone she knew, and showered her with gifts. But for me, it was radio silence. I tried not to let it bother me, but it did. After graduation, I got a job at a large tech company in San Francisco. It was a great opportunity, but I felt this lingering resentment that no matter what I achieved, it would never measure up in my parents' eyes. Then I met Bob. He worked in the same department as me, and we clicked almost instantly. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone saw me for who I really was. He didn't care about my sister or my parents or what I'd been through. He cared about me. We dated for a year before he proposed during a trip to Paris. It was the most romantic moment of my life. I was over the moon, excited to start this new chapter. I hadn't even told my family I was dating someone, let alone that I was engaged. So when my mom called me out of the blue and invited me to dinner, I was stunned. It was so unlike her. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. After my mom's sudden invitation to dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It had been months since I'd last spoken to my family, aside from a few sporadic texts, and now she wanted to have dinner like everything was normal? Still, a part of me was hopeful. Maybe they were trying to reach out and make amends. Maybe they wanted to be a part of my life, finally recognizing my achievements. And of course, there was that tiny sliver of me that still craved their approval, no matter how much I tried to deny it. When I arrived at the restaurant, I was greeted with hugs and smiles. My mom was especially cheerful, which immediately put me on edge. It was rare for her to be so warm toward me unless there was something she wanted. Jessica was there, too, looking as polished as ever. She greeted me like an old friend, though we hadn't been in touch for quite some time. My dad was his usual quiet self, offering a curt nod as I sat down. The conversation started out light. How was my job? How was life in San Francisco? How had I enjoyed Paris? But there was this undercurrent of tension. They were laying it on thick, and I knew there was something they weren't saying. As we finished our appetizers, my mom brought up the wedding. She mentioned how proud they were of me for getting engaged to someone like Bob, how happy they were for me. I could feel the shift in the conversation as she leaned in, her smile widening in that way that always felt forced. "We'd love to help with the wedding," she said, and the air around us changed. I knew immediately that this was the real reason I was here. Before I could even process her words, Jessica jumped in, offering to help plan the reception, talking about how she knew all the best vendors. My dad, who had been silent most of the evening, suddenly perked up and started talking about how it was important to pick a prestigious venue, something that would reflect well on our family. They were all in on it. What started out as a friendly dinner had turned into a full-blown sales pitch for their involvement in my wedding. They wanted to be included in everything: the guest list, the venue, the flowers, the food. And more than that, they were expecting me to foot the bill for this grand affair they had in mind. It was as if they saw my engagement to Bob as some sort of golden ticket, a way to elevate themselves by association. I could see the gears turning in their heads, especially my dad's. He was always one to see opportunities where they weren't. They didn't care about me or my relationship with Bob. They cared about how it made them look, how it could benefit them. I was stunned. It was bad enough that they had never supported me growing up, never shown up for me when I needed them, and now they wanted to waltz into my life and take control of my wedding? I could feel my frustration bubbling up, but I stayed composed, trying to keep the peace for the moment. I excused myself from the table, saying I needed to think about it, and left shortly after, without touching dessert. As the days passed, my phone was flooded with messages from my mom and Jessica. They kept sending me links to wedding venues, dresses, even caterers. My mom had already scheduled an appointment with a high-end florist without even asking me. It was overwhelming, and I knew I had to put my foot down. I couldn't let them hijack my wedding like they had tried to hijack everything else in my life. But at the same time, I felt this nagging guilt. They were my family, after all, and part of me wanted to believe that maybe this was their awkward way of trying to reconnect, even if it was a bit selfish. After a week of dodging their calls, I finally decided to confront them. I laid out my boundaries. I was paying for the wedding, Bob and I were making the decisions, and while I appreciated their enthusiasm, I needed them to respect that this was my day. They seemed to take it well, or at least that's what I thought. My mom apologized for being overbearing, and Jessica even said she understood. My dad, always more passive, didn't say much, but nodded in agreement. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that maybe this was the turning point I had been hoping for. For a brief moment, things were calm. I even agreed to let my dad walk me down the aisle, something I had been on the fence about, and asked Jessica to be my maid of honor. They seemed genuinely excited, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were on the same page. But that peace didn't last long. The next thing I knew, my parents started making grand plans behind my back. They were buying expensive decorations, booking extra photographers, and ordering personalized wedding favors without consulting me. And of course, they expected me to pay for it all. When I refused, they acted like I was being unreasonable, like I was ruining their idea of a perfect wedding. The worst part was, I could tell this wasn't about celebrating my love or my future with Bob. It was about them showing off, using my wedding as a stage to prove something to the world. I had to set firm boundaries again. I told them I wasn't paying for anything beyond what Bob and I had already planned, and I wasn't going to let them take over the event. The pushback was immediate. My mom acted hurt, saying she only wanted to make the day special for me. My dad became distant, and Jessica was clearly annoyed. But I stood my ground. Then, one evening, I got a call from my aunt. She had never been very close to the rest of my family, always a bit of an outsider like me. She warned me that something was going on behind the scenes. Apparently, my parents and Jessica had been planning something for the engagement party. They were going to try and discredit me, make it look like I was ungrateful and selfish, all to get sympathy from Bob and his family. They had even come up with this ridiculous scheme involving a fake necklace, accusing me of stealing it to make me look like a liar. I was floored. My own family was plotting against me at my own engagement party. But instead of falling into their trap, I decided to turn the tables. With my aunt's help, we came up with a counterplan. She got me an identical necklace, and we decided to catch them in the act. At the engagement party, everything seemed to be going smoothly, but I could feel the tension building. My mom was eyeing me the whole time, and Jessica kept making snide comments, trying to get a reaction out of me. I played it cool, waiting for the right moment. Sure enough, halfway through the evening, my mom suddenly claimed her necklace was missing and started accusing me of taking it. I stayed calm as the whole room watched, letting her dig herself deeper into the lie. When she demanded I empty my purse, I pulled out the duplicate necklace, holding it up for everyone to see. The look on her face was priceless. But then I walked over to her bag, opened it, and pulled out the original necklace. The room fell silent. My mother stood there, speechless, her plan completely exposed. My dad tried to brush it off, and Jessica looked like she wanted to crawl under a rock. The embarrassment was palpable. People started whispering, and I could feel the tide turning in my favor. The next day, the fallout began. My phone was blowing up with messages, not just from my family, but from extended relatives and old friends. Some were supportive, but many accused me of being too harsh, of bringing up old wounds and making a scene. They said I should have just let it go, that family is family, and I shouldn't have embarrassed my parents like that. But for once in my life, I didn't care. I had finally stood up for myself, and I wasn't going to apologize for it. Not anymore. After the disaster at the engagement party, I wasn't sure how to feel about my family anymore. A part of me had hoped that things would change, that the humiliation they'd experienced would be enough to make them see the damage they'd caused. But I also knew that it wasn't easy to break patterns that had been ingrained for so long. Still, I couldn't shake the idea that maybe, just maybe, we could salvage something. It was this lingering thread of hope that led me to agree to another dinner with them a few weeks later. I went into that dinner with my guard up, knowing full well what had happened at the engagement party, but also aware that I needed closure. Either things would change, or I'd walk away for good. My family was surprisingly subdued when I arrived. No one made any jokes, and the conversation was oddly calm. We talked about small things at first, like my work and the wedding plans, but eventually, I couldn't hold back any longer. I told them I knew about their plan at the engagement party. I laid it all out, how I had found out, and what I had done to stop it. For a moment, there was dead silence at the table. Then, my mom apologized. She said she was sorry for everything, and so did Kelly. Their apology seemed genuine enough, but I couldn't help but feel there was something off about the whole thing. Maybe it was the way my mom kept glancing at Kelly, as if checking to see if they were both on the same page. Or maybe it was the way my dad stayed silent, not contributing to the conversation at all. I wanted to believe them. I really did. I was tired of fighting, tired of feeling like I was constantly at odds with the people who were supposed to love me the most. So I accepted their apology, but I made a mental note to stay cautious. It was time to see if they really meant it, or if this was just another tactic to keep me on the hook. A few days later, I invited my mom and Kelly to a wedding dress fitting. I figured it was a chance to bond, to maybe rebuild some semblance of a relationship. I wasn't naive enough to think things would be perfect overnight, but it felt like a step in the right direction. The fitting itself was a dream for me. There I was, standing in front of a mirror, trying on the most beautiful dresses I'd ever seen. I wanted to share that moment with them, to feel like they were excited for me. But their reactions were lukewarm at best. My mom seemed distracted, and Kelly spent most of the time on her phone, barely looking up when the stylist asked for opinions. I tried not to let it bother me, but it was hard not to feel a sting of disappointment. Then Kelly saw a dress. It was stunning, no doubt about it, but it was way out of their price range. I could see the look in her eyes, though, the kind of longing that I recognized from all the years of watching her get what she wanted without even asking for it. I knew they couldn't afford the dress, but something inside me told me to offer to buy it for her as a gift. Maybe it was my way of trying to prove I wasn't holding a grudge, or maybe it was just the little sister in me still seeking approval. Whatever the reason, I did it. I bought the dress for Kelly, and for a moment, I thought maybe this would be the turning point. Maybe this was the gesture that would finally show them that I wasn't the enemy. But later that day, as we were leaving the boutique, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. My mom and Kelly didn't realize I was still within earshot when they took a call. I wasn't paying much attention at first, but then I caught a snippet of their conversation. They were laughing, making fun of the way I looked in the dresses, mocking my choices. I could hear the sneer in my mom's voice as she said something about how Sophie has always had such plain taste. Then Kelly chimed in, joking about how at least she's useful now that she has Bob money. They weren't talking about me like I was their daughter or sister. They were talking about me like I was a tool, something they could use to get what they wanted. I felt my stomach drop, and all the hope I'd been clinging to evaporated in an instant. I went home that night furious, trying to figure out what to do next. I felt betrayed, once again, by the people who were supposed to care about me. But I also knew that confronting my mom and Jessica directly would lead nowhere. They'd lie, gaslight, make me feel like I was the crazy one for being upset. Instead, I decided to confront my dad, hoping maybe he'd be different. He had always been the more distant one, but I thought maybe he'd at least try to be reasonable. When I asked him about what I'd overheard, he didn't seem surprised. He didn't deny it, either. Instead, he brushed it off, telling me that I needed to remember my place, and that my mom and Jessica had always been looking out for me. He even had the nerve to suggest that I owed them, that all their guidance had helped me succeed, and that it was time I gave something back. It was like a slap in the face. Here I was, thinking I could rely on him to be the voice of reason, and instead, he was complicit in everything. He believed that I was somehow indebted to them, that their years of emotional manipulation and neglect were somehow justified because now I had money and status. That conversation with my dad was the final straw. I had spent my entire life trying to make them happy, trying to earn their approval, but it had never been enough. No matter what I did, they would always see me as second to Jessica. and now they saw me as nothing more than a bank account to fund their lavish plans. I was done. I couldn't keep pretending that things would ever change. They didn't care about me. They cared about what I could do for them. After that, I talked to Bob and my aunt. I laid everything out for them. How I had given my family chance after chance, only to be met with more betrayal. Bob was supportive, as always, and my aunt, who had seen through my parents' facade long before I had, suggested we do something drastic. She had this wild idea of exposing them at the bachelor party during one of those silly games like Truth or Dare. She thought it would be the perfect way to show everyone what they were really like, to catch them in the act. At first, I wasn't sure. It seemed petty, almost like stooping to their level. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that they deserved it. They had been manipulating me for years, using me as a pawn in their own twisted games, and now they were trying to exploit my wedding for their own gain. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. So I agreed. We set up hidden cameras at the party, ensuring that we'd have evidence of whatever they said or did. The night of the party, everything went according to plan. We played Truth or Dare, and at first, it was all lighthearted fun. But as the drinks flowed and the atmosphere loosened, people started getting bolder. My mom and Jessica were no exception. When it was their turn, the truth started to spill out. They made snide comments about how they were only putting up with me for the money, how they had always thought Jessica deserved better. It was painful to hear, but it was also validating. Everything I had suspected, everything I had known deep down, was now out in the open for everyone to see. By the end of the night, I had all the evidence I needed. My family's true colors were on full display, and there was no going back. I wasn't sad or angry anymore. I was free. Free from their manipulation, free from their control. I didn't need their approval, their validation, or their presence in my life. For the first time, I felt like I could finally move forward without the weight of their expectations dragging me down. And it felt good. The night of the bachelorette party, I had everything prepared. The hidden cameras were set up, the drinks were flowing, and the game of Truth or Dare had finally worked its way into the conversation. I wasn't going to miss this chance. I'd already made peace with the idea that my relationship with my mother and sister was beyond saving, but part of me still needed closure. I needed them to admit what they had been doing all along, even if it was only in front of a small group of people. And if they didn't admit it, well, I had the recording ready to go. The questions started out innocent enough. Someone dared Kelly to text her ex-boyfriend, and my mom's truth involved admitting a crush she had back in high school. But as the game went on, the tension began to rise. When it was my turn, I asked my mom and Kelly about their behavior during the engagement party. I framed it as a light-hearted question at first, like I was just curious if they really thought their accusations about the necklace were necessary. My mom immediately tried to laugh it off, and Kelly started looking down at her phone, clearly uncomfortable. They were dodging the question, which only confirmed what I already knew. So I pressed harder. I asked them outright about the conversation I had overheard at the dress fitting, about how they had mocked me and my relationship with Bob. I could see the color draining from my mom's face, and Jessica's eyes went wide. They were cornered. Instead of owning up to it, they started deflecting, saying I was imagining things and that I was always so sensitive. But I wasn't about to let them twist the narrative this time. I pulled out my phone and played the recording of the conversation I had overheard at the boutique. The room fell silent as their voices filled the space. Everyone could hear them, laughing about how I looked in the dresses, talking about how they were only interested in the wedding for financial gain. It was all there, in their own words. When the recording ended, the silence hung in the air like a weight. My mom and Jessica's faces were a mixture of shock and fury. They knew they couldn't deny it now, so they did what they always did when they felt cornered. They lashed out. My mom was the first to speak. She started ranting about how I didn't deserve the life I had, how I had always been a difficult child, and how she and Jessica had only been trying to help me. It was the same old story of them playing the victims, pretending that all they had ever done was out of love. But the words that followed were even worse. Jessica, clearly furious that I had exposed them, went off about how I was nothing without Bob, how I wouldn't have amounted to anything if I hadn't found someone successful to marry. They didn't care about me. They only wanted what I could provide. That was it. I was done. I told them, calmly but firmly, that I didn't want them at the wedding anymore. I asked them to return the dresses I had bought for them, the same dresses they had been so excited about just days before. Their reaction was predictable. They flew into a rage, calling me ungrateful, telling me I was making a huge mistake. But I didn't flinch. They stormed out of the bachelorette party, slamming the door behind them, and I felt an odd sense of relief. It was over. I had finally made the decision to cut them out of my life. A week later, I woke up to a barrage of texts and calls. My phone was buzzing nonstop. I opened Facebook, and there it was, a long, scathing post from my mom, accusing me of being a cruel and selfish daughter. She dredged up every minor thing I had ever done wrong as a child, twisting the facts to make it sound like I had been the problem all along. To make matters worse, she had included my phone number at the end of the post, encouraging relatives to reach out to me and set me straight. The calls and messages from extended family came flooding in. Some were supportive, but many were accusatory, parroting my mom's words and telling me I was in the wrong for excluding my family from the wedding. It was overwhelming, but I had been prepared for something like this. I wasn't going to sit back and let them smear my name without fighting back. So I posted the videos from the bachelorette party. I posted the insults, the mockery, the cruel words my mom and Jessica had thrown at me when they thought no one was listening. I let their own words speak for themselves. It didn't take long for the tide to turn. People who had initially believed my mom's version of events started reaching out to apologize. Many of them admitted they hadn't known the full story. It was vindicating, but also sad. It made me realize just how deeply my family had manipulated the people around them. But at the same time, I was relieved to have the truth out in the open. I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to keep up appearances or hope for reconciliation. The damage was done, and there was no going back. As the wedding day approached, Bob and I made the decision to hire security. We both knew that my mom and Jessica weren't going to let things go quietly. They had been excluded, and I was sure they would try something to disrupt the day. Sure enough, they showed up, wearing the very dresses I had bought for them. The security team stopped them at the entrance, refusing to let them in. It didn't take long for a scene to unfold. My mom started yelling about how she was the mother of the bride and had every right to be there. Jessica was right beside her, equally indignant, demanding to be let in. The guests inside started to notice the commotion, but I stayed calm. The security guards handled it, telling them they had to leave. Before they finally left, though, my mom pulled the last stunt she could think of. She somehow managed to activate the venue's sprinkler system, drenching herself and Jessica in water and ruining the dresses I had so graciously bought for them. It was petty and ridiculous, but at that point, it didn't even matter. They were escorted off the property, and I could finally breathe again. The wedding itself was everything I had hoped for. My aunt walked me down the aisle, and as I stood there with Bob, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about us, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The drama of my family seemed like a distant memory, something that couldn't touch me anymore. Many of the guests who had witnessed the earlier scene came up to me during the reception to apologize for my family's behavior, but I waved them off. I didn't want to dwell on it. This was my day, and I was determined to enjoy it. I wanted everyone else to enjoy it too, without the shadow of my family's actions hanging over us. After the wedding, Bob and I left for our honeymoon, a beautiful trip through Italy that was the perfect escape from everything that had happened. For 2 weeks, we were blissfully cut off from the outside world, and I didn't think about my family once. But when we got back, there was a package waiting for me. It was the 2 dresses I had bought for my mom and Jessica, crumpled and ruined. There was no note, but the message was clear. They wanted to hurt me, to leave me with one last reminder of their bitterness. Bob was furious. He wanted to sue them for defamation, for harassment, for everything they had done to me over the years. I understood his anger, but I didn't see the point. They had already ruined themselves. They had shown their true colors to everyone, and I didn't need to drag it out any further. I was done. They could keep their pettiness and their resentment. I wasn't going to let them have any more power over my life. In the end, I made the decision to cut ties with them completely. No more attempts to reconcile, no more giving them the benefit of the doubt. They had shown me who they really were, and I believed them. My future didn't include them, and I was at peace with that. I had Bob, who had been my rock through everything, and I had my aunt, who had become more of a mother to me than my own ever had. I knew that one day, when Bob and I had kids, my aunt would be there for them in the way my mom never was for me. And that was enough. I didn't need anything else. For the first time in my life, I was free, and I was happy. If you like the story, don't hesitate to subscribe and listen to new stories every day. Write in the comments what you like the most.